All right, everybody, welcome back to another video. I am recording the first part of this in the car because I just got out of work very early, and I'm going to attempt to brew throughout the afternoon and the evening tonight, and hopefully finish up well before I did last time I got out of work early and tried to brew. But anyway, the point of this is I'm really excited to brew, and I'm already starting to think about it as I've been thinking about it pretty much my entire work day because I'm like planning things out. So we're gonna do a Belgian triple today, which is without a doubt probably one of my favorite types of beer, probably like top 3 styles. Also, not just because it's one of my favorite kinds of beer, but also because it's been too long since I brewed. Just to give some perspective, the last brew I did I referred to as a summer beer, but now the trees are starting to die and it's cold outside, and it's the first week of October, so we're beginning our like effective 6 months of winter here in New England. So unfortunately, the time of summer beers is very much over, and the time of strong cold weather beers has begun. So we're gonna have some fun with that, even though I have a 10.5% Russian Imperial Stout that's ready to be bottled. But anyway, the Belgian triple we're gonna make today. I don't have the recipe in front of me, obviously, but and even if I did, I would not read it to you because I'm driving. The recipe itself is not too complicated, and in fact, it's actually, 90% of the flavor that comes from these Belgian ales is all yeast. So in the Belgian Abbey style beers typically have 4 representations. You have, in order of increasing strength, the singles, doubles, triples, and quads. Starting from the top, quad tends to be the most boozy, strong, flavorful beer out of the 4. They're very dark, they have a lot of spice in them, they have a lot of malt complexity to them, and are typically somewhere like 9 to 11%, and are very fun beers to drink and brew. Then you'll have the triple, which is what I'm making today. The triple is generally around the same strength as the quad, but most often you'll see them be slightly less strong, so 7 to 9-ish%. And it's a golden colored ale, very similar to a Belgian strong golden ale, in fact. But they're very different from the quads, not only in color, but also in flavor. They tend to kick off a little bit more of like a honey-like note, in the examples that I've found, and tend to be rather dry as well. Then stepping down once more, we get to the doubles. They're ruby red, a slightly darker kind of color. They're typically somewhere around like 6 to 8%. And they have similar flavors to quads, but definitely not as strong in alcohol and definitely not as intense of flavor as a quad. And then finally there's the single, or the Patters beer, or the table beer. It goes by many names, but it's effectively the weakest of the bunch. Typically they're pale or copper colored, and they're typically made from the second runnings of a quad or double mash, and those tend to be pretty fun to drink as well. I've made both quads and singles, and now it's time for me to explore the triples and then eventually a double. But today, the triple. I'm keeping the malt bill very simple, and I'm also keeping the hopping relatively low and fairly simple. That's just there for an accent. The yeast in this is really the star of the show. We're using Trappist high gravity ale yeast, and I have a starter going because I'm aiming for this beer to be somewhere around 7.5 to 8.5%. In the meantime, I'm almost home, and I am very excited to get this batch rolling. Alright, so here's our recipe. We have 11 pounds of Belgian Pilsner malt. We have 1.25 pounds of Vienna malt, 1/4 pound of aromatic malt, and then we're going to add 1.5 pounds of table sugar at the very end of the boil so that we can amplify the percentage ABV without adding any body to the beer. We're going to mash this at 149 degrees to increase the fermentability of the wort and keep the body of the beer relatively light. Alright, so for hops, although we're doing a 90-minute boil, I'm doing a 60-minute hop addition for bittering, and that's just going to be the 2 ounces of Tettnanger. And then at 10 minutes, we're going to add 1 ounce of Saaz. So for yeast, as I explained in the car, it's YU's 3787, the Trappist high gravity, and I have prepared a starter for that so that we have enough yeast to properly inoculate the beer and make sure that we don't get any sort of fusel alcohols or pitching related off flavors. And then for water, I'm using my trusty profile for European beers, and that is 86 parts per million of calcium, 11 parts per million of magnesium, 65 parts per million of sodium, 130 parts per million of sulfate, 100 parts per million of chloride, and 90 parts per million of carbonate. And if you're new to the channel, understand that the chloride and the sodium numbers usually don't change because that's my city water, and I'm far too lazy to go get distilled water or reverse osmosis. In order to achieve the profile there, we're going to add 6 grams of gypsum salts, 2 grams of Epsom salts, and 3 grams of calcium carbonate or chalk. Of course, as with any clear beer, I'm going to be adding Whirlfloc at the appropriate time, as you will see. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and start getting our strike water heated up to the appropriate temperature. I'm going to add half a Camden tablet to that water so that I can ensure it is free of chlorine and chloramines, as in the city water, and then we'll start adding our own salts. Okay, so our strike water has reached its appropriate temperature, plus a few degrees to allow for some heat loss as I add the grain. So now it's time to go in. Oh, I just made a massive mistake. Oh boy. As you can see, I just made an enormous mistake and forgot to put my bag in, so this is about to get really interesting. Okay, the day is saved. So ended up putting the bag in another vessel, draining everything out via siphon, and then dumping it back into that vessel, and then I was able to basically just rinse everything down with a little bit of water and then recirculate some of that wort to actually take care of any leftover grains. I ended up not losing any grain, not losing any water, not actually even adding any water, just lost about 20 degrees. So some of the grain here got an unintended protein rest. So we're gonna get this back up to its strike temperature quickly. I have the bag pretty far off the bottom of the kettle so it's not gonna get scorched, and then we'll be able to carry on with the rest of our mash. So thankfully, the day is saved. Okay, so we're back up to strike temps. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the rest of the grain in here, and we're gonna try and avoid disaster for the rest of this brew. Alright, looks like we nailed our strike water temperature, just about 149 degrees. So it is time to wrap this up and let it sit for 90 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes now into the mash, so it's time to grab a quick pH reading. Just an approximation to make sure that we're not too far off on our mash pH. Alright, so at the moment, I'm thinking that's somewhere between 5 and 5.5, closer to 5, so that's good because we were really ideally aiming for 5.2, but I don't have an actual high caliber pH meter to read that yet. So the mash is complete now, and I actually kind of forgot about it for about 15 minutes. So it's lost a little more temperature than I had originally planned on, but that is totally fine. So it's about 145 degrees right now. Starting at 149 is about a 4-degree loss, but that's kind of fine considering that I accidentally screwed up the process in the beginning, as you all saw. So now I'm going to start collecting the wort and making sure that we're getting ready for the boil. Alright, so pre-boil original gravity reading is cooled down, and looks like it's about 1.038. Our estimated number was going to be 1.037, so we nailed that one. Okay, so the boil has begun. We are going to let this sit for 30 minutes before we start adding any hops, because it's a 90-minute boil. Okay, so we're about 30 minutes into the boil right now, which means that we're going to add our 60-minute bittering hop addition, which is these 2 ounces of Tettnanger. So we're going to go ahead and put those right in right now. I missed one. Okay, so we'll come back in about 50 minutes, and we'll do our 10-minute hop addition, and then we'll add some Royal Fluck and some other stuff. So I'll see you then. Okay, so we are now 10 minutes from the end of the boil, so we're going to start tossing a bunch of stuff in here frantically. First of all, I'm going to toss my chiller in the boil so that I can sanitize it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add my 10-minute hop addition, which is 1 ounce of Czech Saaz. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to crumble up this tablet of Royal Fluck to ensure that we have a clear beer at the end of the process. And then we'll boil for another 10 minutes, and then we'll be finished. Alright, so I almost totally forgot to add the 1.5 pounds of sugar that we're supposed to put in at the end of the boil. That's also supposed to go in at 10 minutes, but I completely forgot to document that. It's only been like 5 minutes though, so it's not like it's going to be a problem. Just, you want to put it in the last couple minutes of your boil so that it has enough time to properly dissolve, but we don't want it to caramelize too much over time, which is why we put it in at the end. So when you're putting in sugar, as always, be careful not to dump it all in at once, because then it will stick to the bottom of your kettle and it will caramelize and it will be a massive pain in the butt. So we don't want that. We're going to add a little bit at a time, make sure we mix it up nicely, and let it go. So add the rest of the sugar, and I'm going to add like 5 minutes to the end of my boil to make sure that it's properly dissolved, and then we'll be finished. One more thing as I'm starting the sugar up that you'll notice is that I didn't use the classic Belgian rock candy sugar, because you don't need to. Okay, so Belgian candy sugar is a simple sugar which is easier for yeast to break down, true, but when you're adding table sugar to the boil, you are actually breaking it down into the same simple sugar with the heat and that is in the solution in water. So this has the same effect as adding standard candy sugar to your boil. So the yeast aren't going to be working any harder to eat table sugar as they would be to be eating Belgian candy sugar. So fear not. If you're doing a light Belgian beer that calls for light candy syrup or light candy sugar, you can just use regular table sugar and it will have the exact same effect. Alright, so I think we're just about done, so I'm going to go ahead and shut off all the heating elements and we'll start the cooling process. So just chilling the beer right now and getting some of the first bit of runoff to go into my fermenter so that I can start sanitizing it. I do like to recycle some water if I can, but as usual I will talk about the fermentation process of the beer at this point. So the brew went quite well, really without too many hitches. I did screw up a couple things at first and also at the end, but we were able to adapt and overcome and had no issues with that. So that is good. But the fermentation is important. As I stated earlier, the yeast is probably the single most important component of this beer because it delivers pretty much all of the flavor. So as you've heard rattling off to the side the entire time during this entire video, I have a yeast starter going on my stir plate. So it should be ready to pitch tonight, but in the case that my groundwater is still really warm and I can't get the beer cooled down exactly to the right temperature, I can wait until tomorrow morning. But we're going to try and ferment this at 67 to 68 degrees as best we can. We will get it going. Once the krausen falls, we'll probably actually ramp it up to about 70 to 75 over the course of a couple days once it finishes out fermentation. This is going to encourage it to attenuate completely, and that is very important because we want this beer to be dry as it finishes. We want to make sure that we get all of the residual sugars out of it. We want to ferment as thoroughly as possible, essentially. So basically, if we slowly ramp that temperature up over the course of the fermentation, we're going to have a more complete fermentation, and that is important. So if we start our fermentation cooler, this allows us to actually have a lot more control over how it comes out, and this keeps the yeast from getting too far out of hand and creating bad flavors by pitching too hot. So it is important that we get the wort down to the appropriate temperature before pitching. This could be difficult to do tonight. The groundwater is still warm. So I'm going to kind of play by ear the length of time of fermentation. So I have a very healthy starter, which means that it could totally possibly eat through everything within a week and a half, which would be awesome. But it might need some extra time because of the sheer amount of alcohol in this beer to actually clean itself up and make sure that it's going to taste the right way. Belgian triples typically are bottle conditioned, and I'm kegging my beers, so I'm not quite sure how that's going to play a role. If anything, it means that the longer I keep it in the keg, the better it's going to taste, which is what I think is going to happen. But I do have a problem with patience, and yeah, I'm probably going to want to drink this beer relatively quickly. So we'll see what happens after a couple weeks. But I think at the moment I'm going to stick with doing a single stage fermentation for about 3 weeks, and then we'll keg it and we'll see how it is. If it needs more time, then it's just going to age in the keg, and I think things will be fine. Okay, so our original gravity sample's in. It's an unfortunate low 1060. So basically what happened was I completely forgot that since I'm brewing a beer that is relatively high gravity, that I need to make extra adjustments for that because the system starts to drastically lose efficiency with higher gravity beers. Totally forgot about that. So instead of planning for an 8.5% beer, I should have planned for like a 9.5% beer, because basically if we're lucky, we'll break 7% alcohol at this gravity, which is unfortunate given the amount of effort that I put into it. But hopefully the flavor delivers, and hopefully the yeast does what it needs to do. It shouldn't be working nearly as hard. So I'm a little disappointed, not gonna lie, because I was really definitely hoping for a very different product at the end of the day. But just goes to show that if you start brewing again after a little bit of a hiatus, you kind of forget what you're doing in some ways. So yeah, a little unfortunate there, but hopefully the beer itself is rescued in the process and we end up with still a very good one. But I don't know, if it's not strong enough, I won't be able to technically call it a triple, so I am a little concerned. Pitching temperature, and it is time to go ahead and pitch this 2-liter starter of the yeast 3787 Trappist high gravity yeast, even though this beer turned out not to to be actually high gravity, which is stupid. But anyway, the yeast is going to do its job, hopefully, and we'll hopefully end up with a very nice beer at the end of this. So when pitching, I'm trying not to chuck my stir bar in there, but we're going to go ahead and pitch the entire starter. And as you can tell, I've fully aerated the wort. This time I did it by splashing, which is what I usually do. Sanitize the lid. Airlock. So we're going to leave this roughly 65 degrees for the first couple days and try to ramp it up as it goes. And hopefully fermentation will be completed within 3 weeks. So hopefully it goes well. Okay, so fermentation went really well. Spent about 3 weeks in the fermenter and ramped the temperature up at the end to dry it out, and man, it worked very well because our final gravity is reading about 1.004. So fermentation went pretty well. As you saw, we dried the beer out quite nicely. I essentially ended up taking the temperature from about 68 degrees to 75, a little higher than 75, maybe 78 degrees over the course of 3 weeks, slowly ramping that up. And in order to achieve that, and without having precise temperature control, I took the temperature in my apartment, the ambient temperature, and raised it up to a comfy 72 degrees towards the second half of fermentation. And then I wrapped my winter coat around the fermenter, brew in a bag style, as you've seen me do with my brew kettle. And that helped to trap a lot of the heat that's produced during fermentation. So I was able to raise the internal temperature of the fermenter to somewhere around 78 to 80 degrees. That finished off the beer really nicely. So as you saw, we got a final gravity of 1.004, which is very dry, and that suits the style very well. So kegged it and force carbonated it, and it should be ready to go. So without further ado, let's go ahead and pour this. So it's called October Moon, and it comes in at about 7.4% ABV and 34 IBUs. I called it October Moon because it's kind of like a nice pale golden color. Kind of reminds me of some of those harvest moons that you see, and I brewed it in October, and I'm feeling fall flavored, so there we go. For appearances wise, it does pour with a nice foamy white head. It did have somewhat fine bubbles there, but it does seem to go away after a little bit. Not so much head retention here, but there's still like a fine layer on it. It's going to stick around for a while, so it's okay. I don't think it's completely finished force carbonating. I might need a little bit more time to really boost that Belgian effervescence that these styles are known for. Outside of that, it's a kind of a mid-golden color, somewhat hazy. That will actually change, I think, given a little more time in the keg. It'll probably effectively lager and drop some of the sediment out of solution, but for the meantime, it is hazy, and that is totally fine. Eventually, it will become a clear beer, though. So yeah, color-wise, I think it's really much. Color-wise, it's pretty much on point, and I did only use pale malts. So the aroma of this beer is pretty much entirely yeast. So it's got a lot of kind of peppery, clovey aroma, but a little bit of peach kind of coming through from the back end of it. So I do like that. Not a very strong aroma, but that's okay. All right, next up is mouthfeel. So, I mean, it has a little bit of a carbonation bite up front, and it's effervescent, but the body of the beer is not very, very thick, which is good in this style. Even though it has a substantial amount of alcohol in it, you don't get that coming across in the mouthfeel either. It's very dry when it finishes, so it's not so dry as like a saison or you know, kind of a champagne level of dryness, but it's moderately dry. I mean, it's the finishing gravity is very important in this style, and it does lend itself to feeling a lot more like a sessionable beer, even though it's really not. After all, it is sort of a party beer, if you will. I mean, it's designed to be consumed in vast quantities in order to get you feeling good, but it goes down easy for sure, and that is my point. So flavor this beer is quite interesting. Immediately, you know, because it's dry, it's not going to have that much sweetness to it, but there is a slight honey note in there. It's not a sweet honey. It's kind of like that clovery kind of flowery part of the honey flavor, but without the sweetness. This is not bitter either. I recently had a rather bitter triple by the Real Ale Brewing Company from Texas, on a trip down to Texas I had recently. And that was a really hoppy triple. Like, it was bitter. And I felt like it kind of was thrown out of whack a little bit. It was very dry and very bitter, and it was not what you would consider a triple, but I mean, it was still an enjoyable beer for that. Kind of going off on a tangent there, but this has a balanced hop bitterness. So it's dry and it's not sweet, but it's not bitter. You don't get really any hop flavor out of it. You really don't even get hop bitterness out of it. But it's just not sweet, and I like that. So as far as flavor goes, I mean, the Belgian yeast is obviously the star of the show here, and it has a lot of this kind of peachy character coming through that I'm really liking. It's that part of it kind of seems a bit Saison-esque. It's peachy, and it's got a lot of peppery notes and a hefty amount of clove, but not so much. I think the strongest thing coming through this is a tart peach kind of flavor. But it has a solid malt backbone, because Belgian Pilsner malt is a very own special kind of malt flavor. It's not at all the same as German Pilsner. It has a little more fullness than German Pilsner malt, and I think it's a lot less sweet. So it's a little bit more multi-dimensional. As a base malt, it has a hint of like biscuitiness to it. So all in all, these things do make a really nice kind of marriage flavor. So I would stand behind this and say that it is a very good example of a Belgian triple, if it were not for that 0.1% alcohol by volume that is separating it from being an actual triple as defined by the BJCP. It starts at 7.5%, so technically this is not a triple. However, I'm not going to let 0.1% ABV cast a shadow on this. This is a really good beer. I would enter this in a competition, I'm not kidding. And maybe I should bottle some and actually do that, I don't know. So it's only going to get better with age. The longer it sits in that keg, the better it's going to get. It's a higher ABV beer. It's a Belgian, beer, so it's going to characteristically improve with age as well in a container. So I am very, very happy with this. Overall, I'm probably going to give it an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10. It does need a bit more clarity, and it does need a bit more alcohol. So, I mean, it's not without its flaws. No beer is without its flaws. And it's not a perfect example, but it is a very good beer, and I'm very proud of it, and I really enjoy it. And at the end of the day, that's what matters to home brewers, right? Definitely very happy that I made this one, and I'm not going to change a thing, I think, about that recipe, outside of maybe adding a little extra base malt to account for efficiency losses. So I'm really happy that I could share the brew and the beer with you. If you liked the video, please consider hitting the like button, as that does make my channel a lot more relevant to the YouTube community, the more likes it gets. If you do enjoy watching me brew the beer, talk about the beer, change my equipment around, do all things brewing and beer related, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you do, hit that notification bell icon so you can be the first to know when I upload a new video. If you do choose to brew this beer, please let me know in the comment section below, because I'm delighted to help answer any questions that you have, help you out if I can. And then, of course, it's wonderful to talk about beer with the rest of the YouTube community, because it is also one of my favorite things to do. To my current subscribers, thank you so much for your continued support of the channel. It is actually really fun to see your reactions to the stuff that I brew, and to just get your feedback on everything. So I appreciate it, all of it. So I tend to try and upload a new video every couple weeks or so, depending on the pace of my brewing. But if you're interested in more frequent updates about what's going on in my brewing life, feel free to follow me on Instagram. So there you'll see more frequent updates about what I'm brewing, about what's going on with my equipment, and possibly, what might be coming to the YouTube channel eventually. So that is at The Apartment Brewer on Instagram. Feel free to follow me there. Last but not least, I've included the recipe for the beer in the description box below, but I've also added a list of my equipment in there. So if you're interested in this equipment, I've included links to Amazon where you can buy it for yourself. However, just be informed that if you do click on one of these links and then purchase something from Amazon, I do earn a small commission from that at no additional cost to you. This, rest assured, goes back into the channel to support future brewing endeavors. But under no circumstances feel obligated to do any of those things. Without further ado, I'm going to finish this beer over the course of the next couple of minutes because it's that drinkable. And we'll catch you in the next one. So, cheers.